Welcome back to the Psychedelic Mom podcast. I'm here today with Jasper Degenaars. If I said that right, I'm not really sure. I think I butchered it. Can you say, was that the best one ever?
Oh, that was the best one ever. Degenaars. That's way more exotic. So it's Jasper Degenaars or Jasper Degenaars.
And you are the mycologist educator and Hyphium headmaster of Fungi Academy with 12 years of mushroom cultivation experience and 3,000 students. And you're really teaching us about the intricate world of fungi and how humans and fungi are more alike than plants. And you're bringing so much wisdom to us about fungi. Welcome here today.
Thanks for having me.
So you've had 3,000 students go through your program. How many mushrooms have you grown in your lifetime? Like, any idea of how many mushrooms you've cultivated?
A lot. Would fill up a couple trucks probably.
What originally brought you to mushrooms and mushroom cultivation?
I'm from the Netherlands originally. Maybe some of you know, for a long time, up until 2008, mushrooms were legal to be sold in smart shops all over the Netherlands. Then in 2008, a tragedy occurred, and this a French girl jumped off a bridge. She was underage. She also had other stuff in her system. The committee that did the research on that actually told the Dutch Health Institute not make them illegal, but they end up doing that under pressure from the EU and the mom of the girl that passed away. And there was a loophole regarding sclerotia because they only talked about the above ground fruiting bodies of the fungi. So as some of you might know, certain like psilocybin mushrooms produce sclerotia, which are dense masses of mycelium-like structure that the fungus produces like a last resort when resources become scarce and there's not the right conditions to fruit a fruiting body, produce sclerotia. By the time I turned 18, you could buy these sclerotia, also known as philosopher's stone or as truffles. So when I turned 18, my friend actually brought some to this event where we're going to, and I had like a tiny bit, and I had like a great time, and we were laughing and making jokes. And I remember even like being on a bicycle on this island, and my mom called me, and like I just was like, "Oh yeah, you can just buy this in the store. I'll just tell my mom I'm on these truffles." And that was what I now would call like a museum dose or a mini dose, or some people call like a microdose, like kind of definitely perceptual, but like definitely not like a big dose. That small dose piqued my interest to dive deeper. While my parents weren't home and my siblings weren't home, one day, like a couple of weeks later, I had like a really big experience, and that really like changed the course of my life. I had like a really profound journey and cried out of happiness for the first time that I could remember, and really like got in touch with my emotions and just myself, because I've kind of lost myself. You know, I got bullied as a teenager and was not necessarily having the best of times. And I became a huge advocate. So I started like looking at Arrowwid and all of these online forums that were popping up at the time, and just started learning about all of the different psychedelics and different modes of consciousness. And then I started sharing these truffles with everybody that I was hanging out with and my friends. And then a couple of like months later, I visited a friend who was a little bit older, and he had like a mushroom grow kit in his house. So in the Netherlands, you can buy these grow kits online, and you just need to water them basically, and they'll grow psilocybin cubensis mushrooms straight out of the grow kit. And I was intrigued. I was like, oh man, I've seen these online. That's so cool. You're growing them. Oh, you can buy them. So I started buying them because I did a quick calculation. It's a lot cheaper to grow them yourself than I keep buying them in the stores. And then I was figuring out a couple times, like a little bit in, that I was buying grain spawn. And I figured out that if I just buy some coconut coir, I can even grow more mushrooms for kind of the same amount of money.
Wow.
And that's kind of happening under my bed in my parents' home, and kind of continued on when I moved on my own. And that's kind of how it all got started for me. And then like I started
Wow.
going deep in the realms of mushroom cultivation and never looked back.
So when you started to share these mushrooms with your friends, you had this like really profound experience. Were you finding that those around you did as well? That when you started to share them, it was like similar experiences?
Generally, we were just curious to these different modes of consciousness. I wasn't really seeing them as like big. religious experiences almost, right? It was more of a exploration. A lot of it was just having fun. Like we didn't have toolkits of like, oh, we're going to set intention and we're going to do like a little like prayer ceremony or something. We just like buy them. We would like go to a park and eat them in the park, and then we just roam around town, and we did some stuff that I would ever recommend other people doing. But this
You
is, I think,
survived
the
it.
beauty of being young. Like we never had anything go
Right.
bad, and like also I think a big part of it is the culture because we're not doing anything illegal, right? Like certain journeys we'd be interested in going into a supermarket just for the like obscene amount of visual input, right? Like it's very bright lights and colors and all that stuff. And remember one of my friends having kind of a staring contest with a box of dishwashing detergent and just started like
Who won?
well, I don't. I think the boxed one because he started literally rolling over the floor, laughing on the floor of the
Oh
supermarket,
gosh.
and we were kind of like laughing at him having so much fun. And like this lady just came up to me. It's like, "Oh, is that your friend? Is he okay?" I was like, "Oh yeah, we just had some truffles, just having fun." And she's like, "Okay, whatever." So I think that really was a big conducive environment to having these ridiculous settings that are not necessarily safe, but because we were never afraid of the police being involved or anything,
Right.
they were more safe to an extent.
Right.
And like we never had like a really dramatic bad experience that we had to recover from or like we couldn't deal with in that moment. So it was just kind of young people exploration. And again, I'm not saying you should
Amazing.
try this out. Learned a
Yes.
lot since then.
Again, this is not medical advice, recommendations. You're only supposed to do these where they are legal. The Psychedelic Mom is for entertainment use only. You became really interested also in the ethnomycology. I'd love to track also through the conversation how your relationship with the mushroom has changed at this stage of your life now, whether your experiences are similar or different.
Yeah, so I think my relationship to the mushroom has changed. I feel like my phase of eating these mushrooms every possibility I can is definitely behind me, at least for now. Who knows where life will take me? And there's always also more reverence, right? Like I think in that phase of my life, I was more looking for exploration. Yeah, using the mushrooms as a tool to get to these elevated states of being that I wanted to be in. I think it kind of changed just with a lot of experience. For a long time, I was actually less inclined to work with mushrooms because it was showing me things I didn't want to look at, and I didn't have the tools to look at as a young man. And that swung around when I started traveling, and I was in Southeast Asia and Australia, and I was foraging for them. So I had like this intimate relationship with finding them in their natural habitat. And then that phased out, and then I started feeling more of a sense of communicating with an organism and building a relationship with an organism instead of, oh, I'm just going to use these mushrooms to get where I want to get. But then also I was traveling a lot, so I always wanted to grow. And every moment I was in a spot for more than 3 months, and it was possible for me to set up a little space, outgrow them. But I think that that also like changed the relationship with like how infatuated I was with the cultivation and still reading the forums and reading the books, although like I hadn't grown mushrooms in years, right? So I think that also
Right.
changed that relationship and like how much I appreciated growing these organisms.
I find it fascinating, just your connection to these organisms. Talk a little bit about that. Do you talk to them? Do you feel like as you're growing them, you talk to them? What have you come to know about these organisms and this cultivation of the relationship between you and them?
That's a good question, actually. I do think that there's, and a lot of people that might have consumed these mushrooms might agree with that there is some sort of dialogue happening within those elevated states of being, like the psychedelic state as we refer it to, right? And I think that dialogue can be the spirit of the mushroom. I think it can also be referred to as our higher self. Some people like to refer to them as like extraterrestrial beings, and that could also be the mushroom. The more I study the natural world, the more I see awareness within other living beings. And I think it's a mistake of humanity that we downplay things that can't move around or don't have vocal cords to communicate language as we do, to just push it aside that they're not intelligent or aware or have other ways of communicating with us. The more I started learning about these organisms, not in a psychedelic state, the more I started understanding like, oh wow, we're working with not only like an organism that's very old and very successful, uh, obviously has an immense amount of intelligence in the way of like conducting the orchestra of certain ecosystems and understanding things that we humanity still have issues understanding. Like, for example, helping others is inherently selfish. If we look at mycorrhizal systems, right, that spread nutrients through a forest and help maintain certain tree species that are being blocked by shade or et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's highly intelligent, right? Because if the ecosystem that they're supporting, like for example, a forest, is thriving, right? There's tons of like different trees, and those trees are dropping their leaves that then certain other fungi are consuming as well. And then those fruit trees are producing fruits, and those fruits are then eaten by animals, and those animals like might eat the mushroom, and then the spores go to the digestive tract, but this animal travels very far, and then the spores are spread in a different rate. So like I think biodiverse ecosystems that are more resilient to change, right? So fungi are really good at terraforming certain plots of land and ecosystems to be very abundant. Because again, like if everything around you is abundant, let's use the human metaphor of money, right? If everybody around you is a multimillionaire in purchasing power, and we're not talking about inflation or whatever, everybody can buy whatever they want. Would you still care about like locking up your bicycle? No. Like I just spent 2 months in Japan. I stopped locking my bicycle. And I'm not saying that everybody there
Right.
is a multi-millionaire, but like they have a way
Right.
bigger middle class. And then there's also cultural things to it. But like that's the world we can live in, right? If everybody is abundant and nobody's worrying about, oh, how can I get my next meal or how can I pay for my rent, then generally everybody is more like sustained because then if somebody gets sick, the rest of the ecosystem can support that in the human
So
sense as well.
in a way, the analogy you're saying is that the fungi make everybody in the ecosystem wealthy, nourished, so that everybody's just taking what they need and thriving to the degree that's best for that plant or animal.
Yeah, of course, there's more nuance to that as well,
Yeah.
right? Like, I'm not saying that they're just ultra benevolent and they're like
Right.
elevated Buddhas of the whole earthly ecosystem, right? And all life forms. But if we look at it in the grand scheme of things, that's what fungi do, right? Like they recycle dead matter. And yes, they consume that dead matter, but also whatever they don't consume goes into the soil and creates the soil as we know it, right? So, like, they are giving that abundance to the rest of the ecosystem.
So, what have you learned about, as you mentioned, these fungi are ancient, so much older than humans?
Oh, evidence that we have of fungi is like 1 billion years old, and then there's evidence in like this lava deposit somewhere, like in the seabed of South Africa, that they found and carbon dated to be like 2.4 billion years old, right? So
Wow. Wow.
humans, anatomically similar, humans have been around for like what, 300,000 years. People are saying now our genus has been around for maybe like 5 million years, but even the genus Psilocybe has been around for 65 million years. That's when
Wow.
dinosaurs were still roaming the earth. So
So, these earliest cultures that you've learned about that ingested fungi, what have you learned about them and the different cultures and how they used them and how they ingested them?
well, that's a big question, right? Because
Yeah.
like the earliest cultures we have very little data on. We just have some cave paintings and maybe some tools, and then it's really hard to find the evidence that they were actually consuming them in tools. One of the oldest pieces of art that references mushrooms was found in Algeria, and it's these really famous cave paintings of the mushroom-faced bee shaman, and it's this psychedelic-looking shaman guy that has like a bee face, and mushrooms are sprouting from his arms and stuff like this. And that could actually hint at a potential way that our ancestors in that regions of the world were consuming these mushrooms, right? Because mushrooms, they don't really keep well. They stick around
No.
for like a couple of weeks and then they just rot away. So a way to preserve them is to perhaps dry them in the sun and then stick them in honey. So there was this connection between the bees and the mushrooms because honey is a very good Paleolithic way of preserving these fungi. And then, of
Amazing.
course, there's the blue meat. So you have this mushroom infused honey, and then people would make alcoholic beverages from that, and you would consume that. And people are still doing this today. And you would have an alcoholic beverage that contains psilocybin and psilocin and baeocystin and all these other psychedelic alkaloids that we know and love.
Wow, fascinating. It's interesting. I'm taking this intentional creativity class, and one of the things during this class is really think about if you were going to leave one thing in a book or paint it on a rock or in a cave, what would it be? And I think that's fascinating to think that they were actually speaking of this mushroom and how to preserve it and the importance of it in their culture potentially.
Well, that's the thing, right? Because like to make art, especially 10,000 years ago, when you could be spending time hunting or foraging or whatever people were doing back in the day, meant that they really cared about doing that. You know, we have that in our lives as well. There's always something more important to do. But for our ancestors, it was probably something a little bit more direct. Like if I do something, I have more food, or I have a better tool to gain more
Right.
food. So to make the time for art that long ago, when you're living in what we now call hunter-gatherer societies, nothing was as black and white, right? They were probably doing some form of farming, just moving around, or some herding. Anyhow, like it meant that it had a profound impact. So that also means like it probably was some form of psychedelic experience. And these mushrooms grow all over the world, right? So probably all of our ancestors, like we have written evidence of it being worked with in China. They call it the laughing mushroom. And of course, we have the mushroom stones of Mesoamerica, right? What people call the Mayan mushroom stones that also date thousands of years back. And that's just the stuff that survived.
And did these cultures ingest the mushroom differently? Obviously, they had different names for them. Did they use them for different reasons?
Well, so there's many different species, right? So there's 160 or so species of psilocybe mushrooms that contain these alkaloids described right now. It's always evolving. Debra just found and described a new species, and that was just in North
Wow.
America, right? So it's not, you don't have to go far out into the wherever middle of nowhere to find new species. I found one when I was in Japan recently. It didn't look like the
Wow.
one that is described in Japan, so it might be a new species. We'll see if the genes actually survived the journey. How they consumed them is always different on the culture, right? We don't have many written documents on how certain people were consuming them. It's very likely ancient Egyptians were consuming them. I'd be very surprised if they weren't consuming them. Also in the Temple of Hathor, which also dates back thousands of years, we find a lot of references to mushrooms and potentially a hieroglyph that showcases a mushroom grow kit. So they were perhaps even cultivating
Wow.
psilocybe mushrooms. And we don't really
That's
have a,
mind blowing, isn't it? When you think about it today, like here you are,
of course,
fast
yeah,
forward, doing it
100%.
yourself, to think that these ancestors in Egypt could have potentially been doing that.
It's very likely, honestly, that they were
Yeah.
doing that because it's
Yeah.
like the simple cultivation of psilocybe cubensis isn't necessarily rocket science. It's the same as how the Japanese people figured out how to grow shiitake mushrooms. You find a
Right.
log that is growing shiitake mushrooms, and you put the log of the same tree that isn't growing shiitake mushrooms next to it, and then it's not a 100% success rate, but you're going to see some success because that's just how it works. So if you find mushrooms growing from cow dung and you add some cow dung that doesn't have mushrooms growing from it, there's a high likelihood that mushrooms will start growing from that cow dung as well. I don't think we give our ancestors enough credit, like they were anatomically the same. They were not stupid people that were just banging rocks together, right? These were highly efficient, highly intelligent and capable human beings that were very creative. I think we should give them more credit. People tend to not give them enough credit. And I think it's fascinating that these more archaic ways of cultivation can be overlooked, right? And now I'm speaking about Psilocybe cubensis, but like Teoton anacato, the Psilocybe mexicana that Maria Sabina, for example, like to work with a lot, would be harder to cultivate because it just generally grows out of grasslands. So it's and moving a piece of grass next to that grass wouldn't necessarily work, but they would have patches that would like give back year round. But then they would have different mushrooms that come up during the season, right? So Psilocybe mexicana is kind of at the beginning of rainy season in the mountains of Oaxaca, and then you have Psilocybes up at the Kodan and carulescens all the way to the end in like July and August.
Do you think that the experiences with different mushrooms is that they're all similar, or do we make too much of that? The experiences are different with these different strands.
Well, there's a difference between a strand or strain and a species, right? So a strain is just a thing that is clandestine cultivar, right? So it's like let's say psilocybin cubensis is by far the most cultivated like psychedelic mushroom, right? And that has gotten names like Be Positive and Penis Envy and Jedi Mindfuck and Enigma and all these different things that are, depending on the morphotype, they're genetically very similar. And there's like scientific backing on how similar they are genetically. There's definitely a difference in contents of alkaloids that are produced by these mushrooms, especially albino varieties. And it has to do with mushrooms like us, they produce melanin when they're when they're in the sun. They like protect themselves from gamma radiation. We do that too. Like that's why we tan and get brown skin and all of that. So the albino varieties that don't have that capacity to produce melanin, and therefore they might have more biological capacity to produce these psychedelic alkaloids. That's an idea around that. These names, they might look similar, but they've been washed down in so many different directions that it's really hard to find a true phenotype that carries that name. And people start giving it names, and because they're popular or people think they might be strong, they might have a mushroom that's not related to that at all. So it gets very muddy really quickly. There's no scientific backing. I do acknowledge that certain ones are stronger, but even if the best cultivator grows the strongest one and somebody had no clue what they're doing grows the strongest one, you're going to see like a 4, 5x difference in active constituents. So it's just a roll of the dice, honestly, unless you're growing them yourself and testing uh, directly. There are very big differences between the species on average, right? So Psilocybe cubensis is one species, but if you're growing, for example, Paneolus cyanescens, it's a whole different genus. Paneolus cyanescens can get like 6% psilocybin content per dried gram, which Psilocybe cubensis is like maybe 1.5, right? So it's like way, way higher naturally. I like to tell myself that these different species have different energies and spirits, but then if you would give me three random ones, different species altogether, and I had to tell you which one is which, I could probably not do it. I'm 100% certain that nobody can do this with Psilocybe cubensis strains. I've asked hundreds of cultivators, give me three of the strains you're familiar with, that you cultivated, and I'm going to blind test you, and you tell me which one is which. I've never had anybody tell me that they can confidently do this. So, like,
Interesting.
it's all storytelling, right? Like, we love
Yeah.
storytelling. We like to tell ourselves that, like, you should take hillbilly for ceremony and you should take golden teacher for microdosing. But that's all, like, pulled out of people's asses, honestly.
How would you take us through the ancient use to modern day differences in how mushrooms are looked at, consumed, what they're used for?
You mean psychedelic mushrooms specifically?
Yeah.
Okay. That depends, right? Because, like, it is always a different culture that has different ways of working with these mushrooms, right? For example, the Mexica, which we now refer to as the Aztec Empire, they had a very casual approach to consuming psychedelic mushrooms. They would eat them at parties and they would chew on them very slowly with cacao. And this is all documented because they had a written language, right? So it's not only from what we know from the conquistadors, but also from their own language. And people would eat them at parties and they would dance and they would look introspectively and they would drink cacao. The big difference for them is that a lot of their festivals also were centered around human sacrifice for their gods, right? So it's a very bit different thing than what we are doing right now, but that's how the Mexica rolled. If you then look at the Mazatec people in Oaxaca, were working with it, generally speaking, there would be the sabia or the curandera or whatever that would consume the mushrooms, and you would have a question for that person. That person would consume the mushrooms and they will give you the question. They would tell you what the mushrooms would tell them. And that's another way that a lot of cultures would be working with him. And then you have the Sami people, which are they had the actual shamans, right? Anybody else that we call a shaman is not technically a shaman because that's a word borrowed from the Sami people in Siberia. And they would consume Amanita muscaria, which is not a tryptamine, and it's a very different psychedelic experience. Anywhere from preparing them and fermenting them in reindeer milk, or there's even
Right.
a story of having the reindeers consume the amanita and then the shaman would consume the urine of the reindeer, which I have not fully found scientific backing on. It's an interesting story, of course, and that ties then into the whole Santa Claus story and like how we're doing
Right.
it today. Like it's also wildly variant,
It's
right? People are
wild
like
that the
reinventing.
shaman had pointy shoes. Is this true? That they used to throw the mushrooms into the what would be considered the fireplace, and then they'd hang them on socks to dry.
Yeah,
Pretty
for sure.
wild.
The deeper you get into it and you start reading Allegro's work with the sacred mushroom, the cross, and then you figure out that Christianity might have just been like a mushroom cult and that they just scrapped the whole mushroom part of it, you know? So the deeper you look, the more you find that psychedelics potentially have a root for many religions. And there's even people that would argue that a lot of the Bhagavad Gita in India is based on certain mushrooms, right? Like all of the gods are blue, for example.
Wow.
Why are the gods blue? Because psilocybe mushrooms stay in blue. And then there's different mushroom references to that as well. We have the burning acacia bush in like the monotheistic traditions is the full with DMT, so they potentially had a way of consuming that DMT. And again, we like to tell ourselves stories, and there's a lot of hints, and that if you look towards them, you can find them.
I think too, just as we all know, psychedelics, including fungi, some deeper opening of expansion of consciousness, that it wouldn't be surprising that potentially these stories are true, even though we like to tell stories. But there is something about having an experience with a mushroom. And as you said, even just your first experience, even though it was like fun, it was connecting you to something that feels like some innate true part of yourself that I think ultimately maybe within all of us there's a part of every human being that seeks that deeper knowing of self, deeper knowing of this world. So it wouldn't be surprising that these faith traditions had some tie or connection to fungi or other psychedelic plants.
I wonder, if every human wants to know more about themselves or the world. Maybe the people that we hang out with, but also I also know a lot of people that just like to live in the village that they grew up with. We hang out with the same people and do the same things. So I think the world would be nicer, perhaps, if everybody was introspective and evolving. And I also understand with the people that just like to be simple. Like it's
Right,
nice.
right.
It's comforting. I think our ancestors were very capable of understanding what most organisms in their ecosystem were good for, if they could use them for food or for medicine, or would give them a journey, right? And without the stigma, right? Like most of human history, we didn't have stigma on altered states of minds. That's a very,
No,
really, really new thing. If you don't have the stigma, then there's no reason to ever withhold oneself from experimenting with mushrooms that can
no.
change your perspective and perhaps open our consciousness. I always wonder that, like, I think there's also this thing called psychedelic induced ego inflation and like savior complex and spiritual bypassing that happens within the psychedelic scene a lot. So it can also create a lot of charlatans. So like I don't know if necessarily psychedelics open up consciousness. Like they definitely can show people something, but like I
Well,
don't
you
know if
said in your earlier stages that at some point you moved away a little bit from the fungi because it was showing you things that as a young adult you didn't really want to look at and you didn't have tools for. Did that change? Did you end up deciding at some point, like, hey, maybe I'll go in there and see what the mushrooms wanted to show me and why?
yeah, like there's valuable lessons in these experiences, right? I think that's quite like the universal thing that we all agree. Like that's for some people that this is one of the most powerful experiences of their lives or the most meaningful experiences of their lives. For me, it definitely has been and still can be like that. Yeah, I think the tools and perhaps a mentor, right? Like my parents are not like hippies that have would like could guide me. It's like have that experience, right? So I had the internet, and then the internet was also very limited, especially 12 years ago, 10 years ago. I got more tools. Also, like when you grow older and like I was traveling a lot, you get to know yourself even outside of these psychedelic experiences. And when I had a more profound understanding of who I was and who I wanted to become, some of those lessons were easier. And I think there was also like a part of young adolescence, and especially for me as a male, that there was definitely like some sort of psychedelic induced ego inflations. Like I had all the answers and had all these visions and I saw all those things. And then when the mushrooms were cracking down on me and like kind of showing me the things that I should work on, I was like, nah, not right now. And I think years later, I was like, oh yeah, there's still things I would like to see myself improve in because I have not seen myself improve in those manners. And And I think the mushrooms could be a good tool for that. And especially when I started like working with them in more intentional settings, and even had like space held for me in a group ceremony and one-on-one ceremonies. And I would always just do them alone or like at recreational settings with friends out in the forest or at a party. So when I found to work with them in more quote unquote ceremonial settings, and even had somebody that wasn't on these mushrooms or on the microdose kind of held the energy for me, I was able to go deeper than I had been. And that was
Yeah.
really profound.
Amazing, huh? What a gift.
What a gift. Yeah. I've lived a very blessed life to be able to have a lot of freedom and meet a lot of interesting people and do a lot of interesting things. And the mushrooms have been a silver lining. And when I started working with them more intentionally and I started listening to what they were saying, then suddenly, like, I never thought I was going to be a mycologist as a profession. I thought I was going to be traveling and I was to stay a chef or whatever I was doing at the time. Having the time and the openness to listen to either myself or what the mushrooms told me. It's just a romantic idea of telling, like sharing that what the mushrooms told me. But I do
Right.
truly believe that, right? Like I just do
Yeah,
what the mushrooms tell me to
I
do.
do too. What have they taught you? If you had three things that you feel like mushrooms have taught you.
That I don't know anything is, I think, number one, kindness to myself and kindness to others. And then lastly is not to hold on to things that is not worth hanging on to. Like I used to really get upset about certain things and I would hold on like grudges to people and like all this stuff. And I don't know how that's serving me anymore. I don't think it serves anybody to hold on to stuff.
No.
I do really remember thinking of certain situations and I would cringe about like how I handle this thing, or it was mainly like things that kind of made me look like a fool more so. And now I'm like, oh yeah, that was just me evolving. I still take those moments of growth, like within the journey, especially larger journeys. I still get smashed and shown all my shadows and bad
Yeah.
sides and where I should be improving, amplified, right? Amplified
Right.
everything. And I do think
It's
that
so
like
funny. Sometimes people get like, we should do mushrooms. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, I'll hear people say, they're so fun. And I'll think, I don't know. They have so much to teach. They do it in such beautiful ways. Even like sometimes when they're showing you, there's a loving way that they do it. And they're always, well, not always, but often providing some feeling of love, gratitude for the experience
I think that's why you
at
have to
the
take
end.
the experience as a whole, right? Because like sometimes they're not so gentle, and I think you
No,
can ask it as well, right? Like it's weird because we're living in this psychedelic renaissance, and I'm
right.
young, I'm just turned 31,
I
but I have
know.
had like now 13 years of experience of these psychedelics, and a lot of people coming on the scene that have a lot more life experience than me, but a lot less experience with psychedelics, and it's interesting to see that almost psychedelic adolescence is like, oh, mushrooms are fun. It's like, well, they were fun for me for the first 6 years and I was consuming them every week, and then, they can also not be fun and they can like be hard mentors. And I think that was
Yeah.
my transition and my evolution. And now I can still have fun with them. I just need to like make sure I have like an intention setting. It's like, okay, mushrooms, we're just having fun right now.
Right.
Like we can do work next week. We can do it like we can change
Yeah.
that appointment, so that's
I have you on the calendar a week from now for the hard one.
yeah.
My experience is the same. It was almost like, oh, the beauty, the cosmic wonders, the joy. And then after a while, it was like, yep, now we're going to look at some stuff. Now there's always kind of a mix of both.
I think that's a healthy journey, right? But the thing is, always at the end, it's like, wow, I'm filled with bliss and stoke
Oh, it's
and
so
like
beautiful.
motivation and like excitement.
Love.
And that's because I also have the tools to be working on these systems in a healthy manner, right? And I think that's what we're lacking. I didn't have a mentor person in my environment that I could go to that could teach me about like, oh, maybe you should do some breath work if you're feeling like this, or maybe there's certain meditation techniques, or maybe just something somatic and shake your body, like
Right.
tiny stuff like this that like really can make a profound impact. And today we're actually just launched our psychedelic journey work cohorts, which is going to be like a 7-week container with like really experienced people from all over the world and all different walks of life, and like a collection of just psychonauts and microphiles from all over the world working together and kind of like a mastermind for psychedelic practitioners and psychonauts. And I think that's
Wow.
kind of really important to see, where do we find this knowledge and wisdom. And like some people like, oh, we do a shaman training and then you're a shaman. And this is absolutely not that, because everybody's still on a path of learning, right? But I think we're missing sometimes paths to go to. It's like, oh, you should read this book, could be very helpful. Or then you should like go to one of these lectures, and having a collective container that we can for 7 weeks all look into that together and grow from that together, I think can be very, very powerful. So I'm looking forward
I
to
love
that.
that. Say that name again for someone who wants to sign up for that.
It's the psychedelic journey work cohort. So
I
we made
love
this
that.
amazing course with one of my teachers and friends, Julian Vane. He's a fantastic author and has been in the scene for like 40 years, like truly a psychedelic elder. And we made the psychedelic journey work online course in tandem with the cultivation course, because we wanted people to know how to grow the mushrooms, but also have some of these tools that we were just talking about, right?
It's amazing.
And so that the 7 weeks are kind of based on the video lessons that are like curated. And then every week we're going over the video lessons, but we also have guest teachers, journal prompts, somatic practices, intention settings, and like there's an online cannabis ceremony, and there's some potential for like doing a ceremony with yourself at home, and then like all coming together after that. And
Oh, that's
it's
beautiful.
yeah, I think it's gonna be
Yeah.
amazing.
I noticed you had a little video on lemon teching.
Oh yeah, yeah,
So I'm
yeah. We made that.
curious if you could talk about maybe a couple different ways to ingest mushrooms, your preference, and why.
Okay, so there's a lot of ways to ingest
Okay.
mushrooms. You can just straight up eat the mushrooms, chew on them. If you want to do it traditionally in the way of the Mexica, they would chew on them for a very long time. Eat one mushroom, chew on it for like 20 minutes, eat another mushroom. Now, with the science that we're having, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, because there's some resistance that gets built up for consuming these tryptamines. You can blend it up in a powder, and then that opens up like a plethora of different ways of ingesting it. People like to put it in chocolate, so the mushroom chocolate bars, which I think you need the label. If you put them in a fridge and you live together with people, you should make sure that people know, because we get stories all the time of people accidentally consuming mushroom chocolates, which is not that's not safe psychedelic
No,
practices. People
no.
with kids, this is Psychedelic Mom podcast. Like keep them
Right.
very far away, very far
What
away.
kind of chocolates are these? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. There's
Um,
lots of stories of those.
oh yeah, for sure, for
Yeah,
sure. Although I don't want to speak to like kids eating psychedelics at all. Like I have no understanding of that. I do know they're not toxic. Your kid just needs to sit it out. I don't know what it's going to do on the development of the brain. I don't know if it's
right.
good or bad or anything in between, but they're going to be okay. That's all I can say. But another way of consuming them is, of course, like you don't have to blend the powder for this, but you can make a tea. That's like a more traditional way. This helps often people that can get some of the gastrointestinal issues, like some stomach issues. They generally have a lot of benefit from consuming it as a tea, because what you're technically doing is you're doing a hot water extraction. There's different philosophies. I think traditionally people are told to boil water, put the like turn it off, put the mushrooms in the hot water and let it steep like that. But I've met tons of people that just boil the hell out of that water for 30 minutes, and they have very strong experiences. So whatever you prefer. We'll skip over some of the other ones before we get to lemon techno. Okay, so
Okay.
briefly, there's also people extracting the alkaloids with a lot of ultrasonic extractions happening and putting the mushrooms in gummies. I'm not a fan of this. I feel it's like super American consumerist commercialist mindset. It's like, oh, we're gonna make this accessible and like easy. We have to remember working with like something that a lot of cultures deem as sacrament, and now we're just gonna put it in
Right.
gummies. Like, what if you put ayahuasca in a gummy? I
I
think
just saw
it's
that.
I think it's really stupid, but people are doing it and people love it, of course, because it's very convenient. There's also a fun one before we get to lemon tech in,
Okay.
is
What's the fun one?
you can actually boof mushrooms. People have done
Oh,
it. You can make a tea and let the tea cool
okay.
down, and then with a
Okay.
syringe squirt the tea up your rectum. I've heard very good experiences about this. Like
Have you
I,
done
I've
it? Let's
I've
come
not
on, get
I have
real.
not done it. I'm not that experimental
Okay.
anymore. If I would have learned about this when I was 20, I would totally have done it. Right now, I'm
So,
like,
what are the
what's wrong with
benefits
eating
of
this?
that? The longer journey, the slower come on, the
No, the faster
further.
compound. Like there's
That's what
like
I meant.
it
Faster come on.
bypasses your
Right.
liver to an extent. The main thing is that it's clearer and there's less gastrointestinal issues, because it doesn't have to go through your stomach and most of your digestive tract. It's just like absorbed in the lower part of your abdomen. But the stories are great. And then there's probably a lot of more ways. There was a story of a very confused young man who made a tea and injected it in himself, and he ended up in the hospital for a long way. So
Don't
because
do that.
don't do that. That's another way to do it. Also, snorting mushroom powder, probably not a way to do it. Never read anything about that, but I'm sure somebody has tried it.
I bet
And
somebody has, yes.
smoking mushroom powder also doesn't work because you'll just destroy the alkaloids. And lastly, there's also lemon tecking, which you blend up the mushrooms in a fine powder and soak them in lime or lemon juice for about 20 minutes. And the idea is that it dephosphorylates the psilocybin into psilocin and makes it more bioavailable. Also, people experience a faster come up and a shorter total duration of the experience and less gastrointestinal issues, so less stomach and bubbling and all that stuff. A lot of people really swear by lemon tecking. There's no scientific backing for actually the psilocybin turning into psilocin. I've never came across that, but there's definitely something that happens in the situation.
Right.
And a lot of people actually then separate the mushroom powder from the lemon drink. And recently people have also been soaking them overnight and it turns really blue. And there's many different ways to do this, but kind of cold water, like cold lime extraction is what
Right.
people are very stoked about.
Are you a big fan? Is that your way?
I like lemon tecking for sure. I don't know if it's my way. I do like consuming the mushroom in its entirety because again, there's building relationship and I don't know, having a connection like that. I do also enjoy blending the powder and putting that in a cacao beverage. I have done that before. That's a nice way of doing it. Although sometimes cacao mushrooms can be kind of nice, but also it can be like quite a lot because cacao is quite a big
A medicine of
stimulant.
its own. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's how we've done it in the past. So I don't know if there's a favorite way per se. I also still like a tea, like a nice tea, and then steep it with ginger. That's pretty nice. I don't know if I have
Lots
a
of different
favorite.
ways.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
depends on the situation, I think.
So, cultivating has been such a passion of yours
Hmm.
and growing mushrooms and teaching. What do you love about that process?
I always used to say that the ceremony starts when you inoculate the spores to some agar. There's an intentional collaboration. You can almost call it a symbiotic relationship with the fungus that is then witnessed in its entirety instead of again with the consumer's mindset. It's like I buy mushrooms and I consume them, or somebody that I pay gives me mushrooms and then I consume them and they watch
Right.
over me. I think we tend to slowly move more towards these intentional food systems, meaning like foraging is super popular right now and everybody wants to have a tomato patch and all that stuff. And I think there's a lot of
Really good.
fulfillment we can get out of that, right? And mushroom cultivation, not only psychedelic mushrooms, is kind of this beautiful fusion of art and a science that I really appreciate. And like having that science symbiotic relationship. And I often tell my students, like, we are cultivating them so they can cultivate us.
All right, I'm going to come back to cultivation, but you just said relating. We mentioned it before that you're teaching a lot of conscious relating
Mhm.
at Fungi Academy. I know that's one of the things that you're trying to bring to the community. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
There's a big movement of the authentic relating movement. I'm more of a student myself. My good friend and collaborator Gabriel Derrida is more the teacher in that. But there's so many ways that fungi work in ecosystems that we can mimic. We briefully talked about the sharing abundance, but there's the resilience part, and there's an invitation part, and there's a patience part, and kind of biomimicry our way into human relationships. And with that in mind, we created this human mycelium retreat, which is really focused on these authentic relating and leadership skills and how we can biomimicry our way from the natural world into our human ecosystems. I teach mainly the fungi part of that, so fungal ecology. So we have like a big, good foundation of mycelial knowledge to then practice these authentic relating practices with. And these are all focused on how do we authentically communicate, I think is a good one without causing damage. There's so much just to get into that topic, but nonviolent communication is a part of that. And I really believe that conflict is inevitable, and like our relationships are not defined about not having conflict. but about how we deal with conflict with our individuals. Like think of your romantic partner. It's very unlikely if you're going to be together for many years that you're never going to have a fight or never have a
No,
disagreement. It's just like it's just not going to happen. Think of your business
no,
partners. It's just not possible. So how do we
no.
show
Friends,
up?
family. It's just not possible.
I don't think so. Our relationships are defined of how we deal with that. And I used to be horrible, horrible. I was shouting. I'm a relatively big guy, and I can have a loud voice. So I would use that to assert. And like I had to learn a lot. And like I think nonviolent communication and active listening and repeating and just being aware on like how to work with these moments of conflict has helped me grow so much, not only as a teacher, as a leader, but also as just a general human being. And
Right.
like these things should be taught in school, I think,
Totally.
right? And we kind
Well,
of
it's
build
like,
this retreat around these practice. So we learn this in a small cohort of people that are looking to make an impact within their ecosystems by building community around foraging. We're going to have some of the people, the leadership of Telluride Mushroom Festival in our upcoming retreat as well. So that's going to be super exciting. And like not only practicing these tools, but also building our human mycelial network to find these new nodes and collaborations come out of that. And it's really amazing that some of these tools, people just open up in like 30 minutes. They just met 30 minutes ago and now they're basically best friends. I've never seen anything like that.
it's pretty profound when those tools can be in a circle, in a community,
Mm-hmm.
in a
Yeah.
workspace. Do you want to provide one tool?
I think active listening is a good one. And especially when people are expressing a charge, I think it's really important to fully let them finish. Then, after they finished, ask if they're complete, and then say the following thing. It's like, okay, what I've heard you say is dot, 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 and try to reflect back on what you perceived.
That one I like because I like to be ready for what is coming. So if it
It's
just
also
comes,
disarming.
I get defensive.
Ah, me too. Me too.
My normal reaction would be defensive, but it was said, "Hey, are you open to hearing some feedback?" I might say like, "You know what, in a couple of hours, I actually have to do something first, and then I'll be ready."
Often
Yeah,
I'm
that's
like
a
ready
good one.
immediately, but like if somebody
Yeah.
is like, "Hey, you're being dot dot dot," I'm like, "Well, I have my sword. I go Scott. I have my sword out." I'm like, and I'm pretty good at like fighting back. But if you ask me like, "Hey, can I like share a
Yeah.
charge with you?" I intentionally put the sword very far away, so I'm not, it's not anywhere near me.
Right. I think the other thing interesting about mushrooms is they connect us to our bodies, like our physical sensation world. And for authentic relating, having the ability to be rooted in your body sensations is also a really important part. In particular, maybe even more so for women, but Westerners. We're so disembodied. So to come into our body and know, like, oh, wow, I actually have a charge. Oh, wow, like when this person says this doesn't feel that comfortable, how do I express that? I think mushrooms are really also really good at returning us to our senses.
Yeah, it can be really helpful for a lot of people, psychedelic mushrooms specifically. Sometimes why microdosing doesn't work for me if I need to work, because I'm just like, oh, now I'm in my somatic body and like I need to be, I'm here working with this fucking screen and the internet and all that stuff. I,
Right,
I
right.
can't I can't
I can't be
like be
feeling it
be
all.
no, exactly. Which is interesting. Like for me, if I
Yeah.
need to be productive, I'd rather microdose LSD. But then if I want to go for like a nice walk through the forest, I'd rather microdose mushroom. It's all relative. There was a really interesting
Mm,
study at the Imperial
yeah.
College, I think, this is what Julian showed me, was that like they gave it like experienced psychonauts medium doses of like LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin, and these people couldn't even tell the molecules apart. They're like, I don't know which one
Really?
is.
So maybe it's just like what is happening that particular day, that particular moment with the medicine,
Oh yeah, it's all
you know?
relative, right? It's like I
Yeah,
think
it's
what
all
we ate
relative.
the day before, or even the 20 minutes
Right.
before, has a bigger impact. If we just heard some bad news or like some great news, that has a bigger influence than
Right.
what name somebody gave this psilocybin mushroom 20 years ago.
So if there was one mushroom, psychedelic or non-psychedelic, or three that would you
Oh,
really want people to start cultivating in the world because of their importance to humanity, what would they be?
well, that's a good one. It's a good question. Hippocrates said the best: "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." And I think if we can make especially shiitake mushrooms and lion's mane more accessible to people to just eat, right? Taking supplements, great. They're very expensive. And like I'm not gonna
Right.
go like we don't have the time to go into like my sitting on grain.
Supplement.
Just like find somebody that knows a lot about this and perhaps even grows their own fungi and like get it from them. Don't get it from big organizations. That's the best thing I can say on this topic right now. But eating them is even better for you, in my opinion, and especially shiitake because they can be affordable. These mushrooms, we have the capacity to really upscale and make them just almost as cheap as button mushrooms, I think, and oyster mushrooms. But like, just I'll do three categories.
I think that's a good idea.
So
So
like the gourmet,
shiitake,
yeah,
lion's mane,
lion's mane, eat as much
and
of that as you can. Like
yeah.
I do really think that's powerful. I swear by cordyceps, which is also great gourmet mushroom. Very expensive to use as a gourmet mushroom right now, but the extract at least, like I personally like pre-workout and like just general energy levels. I love cordyceps militaris specifically. You can also forage for it, but like it's really hard and it's just really expensive right now. And I think if we can produce more, because again, these are like very accessible to mass produce. People in China are already doing it. I think it's always better to find a local producer. And generally, if you want to get locally, let's say North American grown cordyceps, like you're paying an arm and a leg. So if we produce more of those, that'd be good. I think what people are finding now, especially people that have been growing and selling psilocybin cubensis for a while. And 5 years ago, you could get like $1,000 for a pound or more, and now it's what, like in the West Coast of the U.S., it's like 200. So I think we have enough of that mushroom. I know people that are sitting on
Right.
so much that they can't get rid of it because it's not like cannabis that you consume.
Right.
Like people
All the
consume up
time.
to a gram a day, and which I
Right.
used to do, and I don't think is healthy. That's a side note. I think we just generally need to do more research on how to grow these different species and like do more research on different species and different effects because there seems to be a correlation with higher bioassistance levels and people generally having more gentle experiences and less, let's call it, challenging experiences. That's all anecdotal right now, but some of these species are Psilocybe mexicana, it's higher in bioassistin, and of course Psilocybe bioassistis, the molecule is named after that species, but that's just a lot harder to grow. But I think we just need to figure out how to grow some of these different species and really find out which one is the best for like which like chemical cocktail that the mushroom produces is the best for certain activities. And right now, Psilocybe cubensis is the most popular because it's the easiest to grow and it's big and
Right.
voluminous, so people can like it's all there's only a financial aspect to it and also an abundance aspect. Like within a couple of weeks of practice can grow enough mushrooms for the rest of their like the lives of you, your friends, your loved ones. It's very like it's not
Well,
rocket science. And but think of a pound of mushrooms. Like I don't think I've even
it's
eaten
a
a pound
lot.
of dried mushrooms in my life. Maybe no, I don't
And
think
you're
so.
right. So, what about another category, like the mushrooms that eat plastic? Would you want people to be growing that? And are those hard mushrooms to grow?
So they're not mushrooms so far. There are some
Are they
species like the Schizophyllum communis, common spitgill, which also has been found to consume plastics, but I have not necessarily heard of a mushroom. They're fungi, right? So not all
fungi?
fungi
Okay,
produce mushrooms.
got it.
Recently, they found that Aspergillus terreus and Angodontium album, which are relatively common backyard fungi that just live in your like Aspergillus terreus, right, I think has been found to be able to biodegrade polyurethane plastic in like less than half a year after it's been exposed to UV. These are very specific conditions right now, and this is pretty heady scientific work that needs to be done first before it's going to have like a home style application. I wish it was as easy as that right now, but yeah, I think that the benefit of that is more finding what are the alkaloids that these fungi are producing that then we can use to like kind of dissolve this
The
plastic.
plastic. Any tip for a grower out there?
Any grower,
Any grower?
mm, spread the spores. Talk, find other nodes. Talk to other people. That's the best thing. I think gatekeeping and like keeping things secret and like holding stuff for yourself is not beneficial for you or your ecosystem.
Do you have a course coming up that
Yeah,
you, yeah.
yeah. We have our cultivation courses. We have one in October. You can go to fungi-academy.com. And it's kind of like a cultivation retreat. So in a week time, you learn how to grow psilocybin cubensis, but also like lion's mane and oyster mushrooms from spore to shroom. You learn lab techniques like to do in like really, really low tech conditions to really high tech conditions. We teach some basics of mushroom farming. We teach extraction, some business practices, you name it, right?
Amazing.
People have started like fully operational farms from taking our course, but then some people just do it for their homestead or grow a tiny batch just for themselves. Like it's really like accessible, and it's really like again diving deep with like a big group of mycophiles that just love it, and the conversations that happen during dinner are also fully like mushroom related. So it's kind of a retreat style. So accommodation and food is included. So you just pay once, and then you just get to our spot, and you figure the rest out. And it's a pretty special time. I'm very blessed to be able to do that, and
Sounds
yeah, just
amazing.
share
Yeah.
doing what I love the most with the world.
Yeah. Have you had a chance to do mushrooms with your mother? Since we're on the psychedelic mom, I'll ask that question.
Not yet, but she is very interested. So I'm going back home in a couple of weeks, and I think that it's going to be
Okay.
on the
Report
table.
back.
I don't. I think there's always sometimes this. It can be nice, but there's the stories with her mom, and maybe helping her find somebody that she doesn't have stories with, because I don't want to
Yes.
like make her feel or like something that comes up, and then she thinks she's been a bad mom to me, and I am sitting there and I'm just like in her face about that. You know, I don't know, for somebody's big experience is somebody's in their 60s, but we'll
Yeah.
see.
Yeah.
I'll let you know when it
Yeah.
happens.
Let me know. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me. It's been
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. It's been really fun. Anything else that you would like to impart to a listener who's listening today to this conversation?
Be curious,
Yeah.
explore within yourself, other cultures, be open-minded. I don't know, like the classics. Not be dogmatic, I think, is a good one as well. I think we get very dogmatic in things. And learn how to grow some mushrooms.